As a professional artist, it can be extremely difficult to balance your creativity with your career. And I'm not gonna lie, I'm a klutz. My balance is terrible. Somewhere along the way, I stopped loving my creativity and started treating my art as a job and a job only, which left me feeling not great. So, fed up with my mindset toward my art and my creativity in general, I decided to make a last-ditch effort to nurture my creative practice, to fall in love with it again and consistently show up to it. At the beginning of July, I set the intention to create one piece of art every day on some random old scraps of paper to do just that. All I had to do was make something. So in week 1, we started at ground zero, pulling out the weeds of my creative garden and planting some seeds. The idea was simply to spark some joy in my creative practice again by making something each day, whether it was a 5-minute sketch or a 3-hour painting. In week 2, we started tackling some pretty big weeds, namely my limiting beliefs. Beliefs like,
I shouldn't explore new subjects, and I need to pick one medium and stick to it.
Beliefs that started as good intentions to create a niche for myself in the art world, but ultimately ended up crippling my creative practice. I'm a very curious creative. I thrive on exploration, and I needed to tackle the limiting beliefs that were holding me back from that. But during week 3 of this intention, it was time to tackle a different beast: fear. I think we can all agree that fear is a very real thing in our creative practices. Fear that our skills aren't strong enough to create what's in our minds, or fear that no one else is gonna like it. Fear that we ourselves won't like it. Fear that we'll have wasted hours on something that amounted to nothing more than a colorful dumpster fire. Now, I'd like to say that during this week, I overcame all of my art fears, but that's not the truth. The truth is, I don't really think overcoming your art fears is really possible. To overcome means to defeat something, and I'm not sure we ever really defeat our art fears. But I do believe we can face them. And to face them, we need to understand them a little better. So let's look at what I believe are the 3 biggest and most common fears for artists. But first, what is fear? Fear is a feeling of anxiety rooted in uncertainty, and the very act of creativity is uncertain. You can do all the planning, all the sketching, all the color and value comps, all the practice studies, but you still cannot predict the outcome of your artwork. Maybe your dog bumps into you while you're painting and you run a streak of bright blue where there wasn't supposed to be one. Maybe you run out of ink before you finish your new pen drawing and discover that the ink you were using is now discontinued and there's not another exact match out there. Or maybe you follow all your planning to a T and the outcome just doesn't make you feel the way you thought it would. In the creative practice, anything can happen. It's an uncertain process. And all this uncertainty means that creativity requires courage. The courage to step out of our comfort zones, step into uncertainty, and make something anyway. The courage to face the possibility that we aren't good enough, that we're gonna mess up, or that we may not like what we end up with. So what are the 3 biggest creative fears? Number 1, the fear of imperfection. The fear that we are flawed and our art will be flawed. Spoiler alert, we are not perfect people, and therefore we are not perfect artists. And imperfect artists make imperfect art. There's always going to be something that we could have done better. A brushstroke we could have been looser with, a detail we could have added, a color that would have fit better than the one we used. I think a lot of people view perfectionism as a good thing. It means you're always striving to be better, always pushing yourself to the max, always doing your very best, right? But I honestly believe perfectionism is just another word for the fear of imperfection. And when your creativity is rooted in fear, I think that makes for a very unhappy artist. An artist that is so focused on the outcome of a piece that they forget to love the process that it takes to get them there. An artist that believes in method over magic, technical skill over emotional response. But I believe that true art is emotion. You can have the most technically good piece with absolutely no emotion behind it. I think that's part of what we're seeing now with AI art. computer-generated imagery that is technically good. I mean, good values, good composition, good color palette, but it's void of any human emotion behind it. But we're straying off topic here. The point is that focusing too much on perfection, letting the fear of imperfection be the loudest voice in your head, that usually does one of two things. Either it stops you from making art in the first place, or it crushes the joy you have in your creative practice. And if you aren't really enjoying your creativity, then what's the point? So how do we face this fear? Well, first, I think it's important to acknowledge that wanting to do your best is not a bad thing. In fact, it's a good thing. It means we care enough about our creativity that we want to put our effort into it. But we also need to acknowledge that our best will never be perfect. And sometimes our best isn't even that good. To face this fear, we need to embrace the messy. Embrace that the creative practice is itself a messy process, sometimes both literally and figuratively. The charcoal powder gets everywhere, the varnish stinks up the room, the eraser shavings from that hand you redrew 87 times are all over your desk now. Maybe the pen strokes and your hatch marks are a little uneven, you accidentally left your pinky fingerprint on the corner of your oil painting, or your gouache color comes out just a little bit muddy no matter how many times you try to mix it. Art is messy, and that's okay. We can quiet that fear of imperfection by embracing the mess. Embracing the reality that we are imperfect artists, but remembering that the art we make can still be beautiful even in that imperfection. In fact, I think sometimes the flaws can make our art even more beautiful. Yes, we can try our best, but we have to remember that our best doesn't mean perfect. Fear number 2, fear of failure. I think this one kind of goes hand in hand with the fear of imperfection, but they are a little bit different. Where fear of imperfection is more the fear of the little things that make your art imperfect, fear of failure is the fear that the whole thing is a waste. The fear that the mistakes in the piece will outweigh the good parts. The fear that you'll spend hours on a piece that your client doesn't like and refuses to pay for, or your art teacher holds up as the example of everything an artist could do wrong for the assignment. We tend to treat failure like it's the absolute worst thing that could possibly happen. But in a world where we're told that our productivity and the quality of our work are directly linked to our value as a human being, why wouldn't we? We need to acknowledge that failure is one of the potential outcomes every time we make something. But we also have to remember that our worth as a creative and as a person is not dependent on the quality of what we create. You're still an artist even if the last 8 pieces have been absolute failures. You're not a lesser person because you're lacking anatomy skills or color theory skills. And we can know all these things and believe all these things and still feel that fear of failure every time we show up to our creative practice. So to face that fear, we have to embrace the risk. The risk that we might mess up. We might not have what it takes to make what we have in mind. We might end up with a glorious dumpster fire of a failure. You face the fear, you embrace the risk, and you show up anyways because your creativity is worth it. I also want to mention that failure is a very, very necessary part of artistic growth. It's our most powerful teaching tool. When we fail, we learn what not to do. When we fail, we learn how to do better next time. Mileage is very important as artists, and failure makes up quite a bit of that mileage. So the time you spend on a failed piece is never wasted because you're learning, and learning itself is never a waste. The third fear, and I think the most uncomfortable and vulnerable one, is the fear that you won't like what you make. Art is so deeply personal. It's an outward expression of our inner thoughts and emotions. When we create, we put a little piece of ourselves into what we make. So when you don't like the end result, it just kind of feels like a betrayal. Like maybe we don't know ourselves as well as we thought we did, or maybe the piece shows us a new side of ourselves and we don't like what we see. Creativity is deeply personal, and when we don't like what we make, that pain is deep and personal too. And sometimes you can't even figure out what you don't like about what you made, and that in and of itself is very frustrating. So to face the fear of not liking what you make, you have to embrace every piece as part of your creative practice. Each piece, the good, the bad, the ugly, and the great, they all make up your creative practice. Those pieces have value beyond our emotional attachment to them. The pieces we don't like teach us what we do like. They teach us what our tastes are as artists. They also show us where we maybe do need to grow a little bit in our skills. And even the pieces we don't love, maybe they're still a blessing to someone else who sees it. Maybe you couldn't get the pose right and discover that you need to brush up on some figure drawing. Maybe you painted a bakery case and realized that food painting is not where you want to spend your time. Maybe you don't love the piece, but it's the new favorite of one of your fans on Instagram. These pieces we don't love are still members of our creative practice, and we need to embrace them as such, even though it's kind of uncomfortable. I do want to add a caveat here. Don't make something you don't like simply because someone else does. If you hate painting people, don't do portrait commissions just because they're popular on social media. If you don't love the way your ink drawings turn out, then don't start working exclusively with inks because the post you shared of one got the most likes you've ever gotten before. The art you make should be a reflection of your tastes, no one else's. So I noticed a common element among each of these fears, and I'm curious if you noticed it too. I had the briefest urge to reenact Dora the Explorer's
Can you guess what it is?
and then just stare soullessly into the camera. Anyways, I won't do that. I'll just tell you. Each of these fears puts more focus on the end result than on the process as a whole. These fears are all lies telling you that the end result is the most important part. But the truth is, creativity is about the process. It's about the experience of creating something. Yeah, it's great when you end up with a piece that you're really proud of and want to share with the world around you, but it's the joy in the act of creating that matters the most. If it was only the end result that drove us forward as artists, most of us would quit creativity almost immediately. Because we'd have this string of imperfect and failed pieces that we hate, and we'd say,
well, what's the point? I'm not succeeding, I'm getting very overwhelmed, everything I make is trash, and I can't take it anymore.
But it's the love for the process that keeps us going. That keeps you creating even when you've had that string of failed pieces. When it gets frustrating and uncomfortable and the fear shouts its lies at you, the love of the process keeps you showing up. In one of the journal pages for this week, I wrote, I persevered through fear today, and that will help me create more courageously tomorrow. The only way to get better is to keep trying and keep persevering through the fear. So when we keep coming back to the practice, when we keep showing up for it, we build creative courage. When overcoming our fears isn't an option, that courage helps us face it anyways. Because maybe creativity isn't about making something beautiful. It's about having the courage to show up at all and make something. So let's chat a little bit about the pieces for this week before we say our adieus. We started off with Stanley, the Marikey Meadow Milkman. Slow but steady, this little tortoise brings milk to every member of the meadow. Now, I don't remember the context at all, but someone mentioned a milkman at church, and I was like,
oh my gosh, the meadow doesn't have a milkman. We must remedy this as soon as possible.
I don't know, man, you really can find inspiration in the strangest places sometimes. So the process for this one was a little bit frustrating. I struggled a lot with the pose and definitely had some fear that I wasn't gonna like how this one turned out. I also struggled some with the values. Because this is a colored pencil sketch, it needed to have some pretty clear value separations to help communicate the form of the character and his props. Was I fully effective with this? Debatable. But like we talked about earlier, no piece is perfect. Overall, I do like how Stanley turned out.
I think he's pretty cute.
So the next piece was the ink and watercolor peach painting, and let me tell you, that was one of my favorite pieces of the entire challenge. I've had a lot of fear around watercolor and inks, mostly because I don't use them very often, but I struggle sometimes to make them work with one another. Like, I don't use gouache with inks because the gouache would just cover the ink drawings up anyways, but sometimes that also happens with watercolors. Like, the watercolors start to kill the lines of the ink, and I don't want that, but I don't know how to make it not happen. But this time it didn't. I don't know why, but it was a very seamless and very peaceful process, and I had such a great time painting these peaches. I had a lot of fun exploring different marks with my dip pen, exploring the blooming effects of the watercolors, and also the different ways that you can layer watercolors. Now you might be thinking,
Allie, we didn't see that part. What happened?
apparently I accidentally deleted that piece of footage and it was irretrievable on both my phone and my computer, so I'm sorry. I already cried enough tears over it for the both of us, so let's just move on. Next up was the little tomato girl sitting on the floor in her socks. I'm not gonna lie, I wasn't really a fan of this piece. It's not bad, it's just not my favorite. The pose kind of turned out wonky, and that just happens sometimes. Honestly, I think that was one of the best lessons I learned during this whole intention. Because I was making so much art, the pieces I didn't really like didn't really bother me as much. I still had so many opportunities to make pieces I did love. And like we talked about earlier, each piece teaches us something, and we can still acknowledge the icky pieces as a valuable part of our creative practice. So on the next day, we got gouache again. I had a hankering to paint some more groceries, and that's what we did. I painted a little bag of groceries in this, like, scattering of groceries, I guess. What can I say? I love painting food. I definitely didn't go nearly as realistic with these ones. I kind of wanted to focus more on simplifying. I had a lot of fun with these. The day at the market vibes were very cozy for me. For this day's journal, I wrote about how content I felt while I was painting. You know, sometimes I really love to explore and try new things and be a little bit chaotic. But this creative session, although maybe not as exciting as all that, it was just very peaceful, very cozy. Just me and the paints and the palette having some cozy fun. So the last piece for this week was a little bit off the wall, a little random. At first, I showed up with absolutely no ideas, just crickets. But after a little bit, I decided I wanted to explore a little bit of anatomy. And one of my favorite ways to do that is by sketching different yoga poses. It was quite slow going at first. I was kind of afraid I wasn't going to be able to fit the whole pose on the page, so there was quite a bit of erasing. But I actually ended up really loving the final sketch. I had a lot of fun and a little bit of frustration exploring how skin and fat folds over on itself depending on how the body is twisting and turning. So for example, when the femur is perpendicular to the torso, there's always going to be a very significant crease and a little bit of fat folding where the femur inserts into the hip joint. Or when the back is arched, usually at least a little bit of skin is going to fold over on itself. I don't know, I just think it's so interesting how the body changes and contorts in different poses. So during the weekly review journal pages for week 3, I asked myself, how has your creative practice improved this week? And here was my answer. I'm just having more fun and not feeling like it's a chore to meet my intention. It's becoming a fun habit. The more I faced my fears, the less pressure I felt going into each new piece. That creative courage was really building on itself, and I was just getting excited to show up every day. But we still had 2 weeks left, and I was going to be facing another big battle in the next one. Anywho, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed chatting with me about facing our art fears and building creative courage. Huge thank you to the Cozy and Curious Creatives over on Patreon for helping to support my art journey. Stay tuned for the final video where we'll wrap up everything I've learned throughout this intention and take a tour through all the art pieces. If you're interested in chatting more about uncertainty and how we can go for our goals in spite of it, then head on over to watch this video next. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye guys!